Good afternoon. It's Friday, the 20th of November 2015, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Brian Gerrish. With me in the studio behind the technical desk, Mike Robinson, and we will be joined by live video link with David Scott from Northern Exposure. I've just had a brief chat with David. He tells me that the weather north of the border is cloudy, but slightly moist. We've got some pretty grey and drizzly reports for the rest of UK, but somebody says it's blue sky and sunshine in Norfolk. So at least the people in the lowlands of England are feeling happy. Well, where are we going to start today? There's really so much going on. It's difficult to tell. We thought we'd have a little look at Telegraph Politics in their Good Morning report. My goodness, trouble breaking out in the European Union because, of course, the free border policy under the Schengen Agreement has brought a few little problems that apparently these nasty terrorists have simply been moving freely around Europe, and it's now getting very difficult to protect European borders. That will be interesting to watch, Mike, I think, as the original architects of the Schengen Agreement are presumably put close to the fire and the hot irons warmed. Indeed. So we just have that as a bit of a background. But of course, more important things are international politics and China.
Well, it's interesting that Common Purpose has finally put something on their blog, which at least in part I can agree with. But this is from Robert Kerr, and he's talking about let's stop pointing the finger at China. Of course, this is with regard to carbon emissions. And he says it's not often, he says that China is the world's pariah, generally speaking, with regard to the climate change agenda, but he's pointing out that it's doing more to promote so-called renewable energy than any other nation on the planet. And he rightly identifies why, because their industrial revolution has come on so quickly compared to the rest of the world that they've ended up with a pollution problem. But of course, he doesn't admit that China doesn't buy into the climate change propaganda of the West at all. And he conveniently doesn't mention that China is far from relying on renewables to replace coal-fired power stations. Most of the investment, in fact, is nuclear, I suppose. But nonetheless, the chair, Robert Kerr, is the chair of the CP Charitable Trust. And so he does find himself, I suppose, at odds with the rhetoric from most of the Western establishment. And so we ask why. Well, this is Robert Kerr, and he recognises the extremely important place of Common Purpose in the global towards globalization, because we can't have globalization without global future leaders, of course. And, Common Purpose alumni, they are the global future leaders. And when people operate by the Common Purpose, according to Robert Kerr, the world will become a better place. We may have a different view. But anyway, why are they so keen to be positive about China? Well, because, as you pointed out, they are getting their claws into China as quickly as possible. And I suppose the Chinese, this is really something, an ideology that the Chinese, even the Chinese, would not want in their country, Brian.
It's quite incredible, isn't it? I had to sit tight there as you opened the comment on Common Purpose. Of course, Common Purpose driving for the close down of free speech via the Leveson inquiry, and Common Purpose driving up the Hacked Off campaign, supported by such organisations as Full Facts, who say only they can tell the truth. So very interesting that Common Purpose having a problem telling all the truth, but they are the people to be selected as the leaders to run the world. David, perhaps we should bring you in, because I think you've been testing Scotland in terms of Common Purpose expenditure, at least.
Well, we put a Freedom of Information request into the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service, my favourite organisation in Scotland, to ask whether they were spending any money in the last 5 years on Common Purpose training courses. And in 2010, 2015, they spent around £5,000 or £6,000, and not one penny since. That, Brian, might be your fault.
Well, it could be my fault, but I'm going to say to people today, don't get complacent about Common Purpose, because whilst we know that there's been a sort of reduction in their training effort within UK. As Mike's shown very clearly here, their agenda is now full-on globalist. And we should certainly remember that it was Common Purpose boasting of getting its training teams into Libya, for example, using European money in order to help the Libyan civil service rebuild itself in a proper democratic model. So still, in my opinion, a very dangerous political organisation masquerading as a charity. But of course, it gets very dangerous when we say, where has Common Purpose penetrated in the UK? So let's bring in this. This is a list of graduates. Don't really need to see them all. This is the bit we're interested in because, of course, it was the UK column that showed that Common Purpose had penetrated GCHQ. So we have a political charity with political objectives to create future leaders, help the breakdown of nation states, closely linked in with organisations like Demos, who we're going to be mentioning. And apparently we should not be worried. Well, the Daily Mail's picked up a bit on recruiting from GCHQ, and apparently GCHQ has employed a company to graffiti pavements in order to recruit likely new candidates for them. Now, it's explained that this isn't paint on the pavement. They've simply used a high-pressure wash to clean the letters. So this is apparently clean graffiti. But as it says here, GCHQ is always looking to widen our recruitment focus to reach the people we'd like to recruit, and therefore we use a range of innovative channels for our advertising. Well, we just thought we'd remind people that, of course, George Osborne has been in there. This is a £1.55 billion operation, and as we're going to show, it's employing Occupy Mars geeks. Well, money is a problem for the country, but George Osborne's reassured GCHQ that there's no shortage of money for spying, and as we're increasingly seeing, no shortage of money for spying on the British public. So GCHQ employs 6,000 people. You can relax because people there wear jeans, shorts and flip-flops. They wander around drinking Starbucks coffees. One computer geek was with an earring was working there wearing a t-shirt saying Occupy Mars. More like the headquarters of Google, and it's got a 600-seat restaurant, shops, a gym and a chapel. Now, just remember that this is the same organisation that, despite numerous warnings of attacks in Europe, France and I believe Paris, also from a number of different sources, including the Iraqis, the Turks and the Israelis and the Daily Mail and Fox News, GCHQ was unable to warn the British public that there were dangerous attacks coming in France. Perhaps they were just there watching their Martians occupying whatever. So, of course, we had the Snowden leaks actually warning that GCHQ was acting outside its remit, too busy hacking into private email accounts and not watching international terrorism. And we should also remind ourselves what the former directors of these organisations get up to. This is MI6 chief, former MI6 chief John Sawyers and former GCHQ director Ian Loban, and they've been recently hobnobbing with hedge funds and banks and large commercial organisations. Should we be concerned about the state of GCHQ? UK column is going to say we should be very concerned indeed, not only for the 1.55 billion, but what appears to be incompetence in the organisation in protecting this nation. Despite that, they want more powers. If you want to get inside the minds, have a look at this. We've got the man himself, Mr. Sawyers. He says we cannot have no-go areas in our communities where the police cannot go, because that just allows space for the evildoers to ply their trades. It's the same in the virtual world. So I think the real meaning in his eyes is that the police should have free access to your home, and security services should have free access to our personal web communications, because we have all become the terrorists. David, these people are just becoming so outrageously arrogant. You can see the danger building.
You can see the danger, and we'll come to this later on. You can see that there are agendas which are being hidden. That are not the viewpoint of the people of this country, and these agendas have been pushed forward by security services, irrespective of what we may want, because our wise overlords know better. I was struck by the fact that when the Berlin Wall came down and communism as a force and a threat ended in spectacular fashion, the security services seemed to be quite surprised. We think that the CIA found out about this when they read it in the Washington Post. For all the money that's spent, they didn't actually detect that big change coming, and it seems that they can, despite all the investment, miss the big picture very often.
Well, miss the big picture, or perhaps they actually know the picture beforehand, so don't feel that they need to tell anybody about it. Berlin Wall coming down, quite remarkable, because I still remember the astonishment of people in the military at that stage when they'd been doing their jobs up to the evening, when I think it was Ben Bradshaw of the BBC was busy saying, don't worry, communism has simply disappeared, Berlin Wall's coming down, you can all relax. Complete nonsense and propaganda, highly dangerous. But yes, you're right, there were no reports from our own security services on this state of affairs. Well, of course, Common Purpose has also been very, very active of getting into schools and into the minds of school children. This is an interesting article from the Mail here. Naive children who believe everything they read online. There's been a survey carried out. Apparently, we've got to be really worried because our children are believing everything they read. And this is James Thickett, Ofcom's Director of Research. Children can find their way about the internet, but they're lacking the nous to work out what is helpful and what might be a scam. They're not stopping and thinking. Potentially, it could make them very vulnerable. Well, we thought we'd do our research and have a look at Mr. Thickett and to see whether he would be telling the truth. Well, here he is on the Ofcom site. And you might be interested to know that he's made himself Director of Nations. So he's increased his oversight of offices in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, and he's decided to call himself Director of Nations and Market Developments. And if you like that, you'll probably like the fact that he was formerly Controller of Business Strategy at the BBC, so totally independent, believes his own rhetoric, no doubt the BBC tells the truth. And if that's not enough, well, previously he's been working with the Walt Disney Company. So they're really piling on the pressure over this. And we thought we'd have a look at who has actually written this report. Here's the lady, Catherine Rushton. This is part of her Twitter page, obviously. This lady appears to be obsessed with Kids Company. Everything to do on this page is to do with Kids Company. There's no proper investigation. She's not pointing at the public at any investigation into circumstances around Kids Company. Here it goes on, but we notice this at the bottom. She's promoting her talented husband, who's just launched an EP, so we thought we'd have a look at that because it's all interesting truth, of course. And here is the site, Captain Goodnight, but there's a warning that the language is pretty unpleasant in the lyrics to this. And then she's got some good advice for young girls. Learn to code and don't over-tweeze your eyebrows. And she then threatens to punch someone if her dinner isn't hot when she gets home. So this is the quality of the Daily Mail reporting that our children can't work out what's rubbish on the internet or not. But David, I had trouble with this one because by the time I'd gone through this, and you see the quality of the people who are supposedly printing fact, it's outrageous.
It is indeed. Just to nip back to Ofcom, Director of Nations.
Yes.
A, who calls himself that? B, what happens when he gets promoted? What's next? Emperor of the Universe, Ming the Merciless.
No.
I want to know what the next step up in the ladder is for the Director of Nations. And I also saw, thanks to the column, that your good friends in ATVOD are going to be collecting P45s in the next little while.
Well, it's still a little unclear, David, whether they're actually all going to receive P45s. The board minutes recognise the, what did they say? They said that this was a period of uncertainty. So no doubt some of them will end up working under Ofcom. But so long as Peter Johnson isn't one of them, that's fine.
Well, there we go. They imposed a period of uncertainty onto the UK column. I remember a memorable broadcast involving a Bonio box, and it seems only fair that they should have a period of uncertainty themselves.
I would say so. But we're a little bit suspicious about this report from Ofcom because it reminded us of something, and here it is. This was Demos a little while ago, which produced a massive tirade about truth, lies, and the internet. This is what they said. There's an equal measure of mistakes, half-truths, propaganda, misinformation, and general nonsense. Knowing how to discriminate between them is both difficult and extremely important. The real Demos message, as far as we're concerned, is, sorry, that should be teach. I've obviously failed for spelling. Allow us to teach your children how to find truth. This was the report, Truth, Lies and the Internet, a report into young people's digital fluency. Remember, of course, the background of Demos. It's Marxist in its origins. Trust them. Well, no, it's trust this man, actually, one of the lead authors of the report, director of the Centre for the Analysis of Social Media. So this is the man we should trust. Of course, we know nothing about him, but he's been tweeting out that he's written a new report. Interesting, this one, he's been working with Ipsos Mori. So was this joint collaboration in order to make sure they got the right results? And here's the reminder, Demos was formed by former Marxism Today editor Martin Jacks and also Jeff Mulgan, later top government advisor to Blair. So our rule for school children is don't trust a word that Bartlett and Demos say. But you've got something rather more serious, I think, than that particular article, which is rethinking the whole of education.
More serious, but entirely related, because it comes from the same place. It comes from the same pool of ideas. So this is out of the UN, and it describes how we should be organising the education system for the 21st century. And it is entirely to do with controlling how people think and not giving them the access to knowledge and the tools to teach themselves, which is what education should do, but instead very much controlling how they think and affecting a very much a Marxist, socialist and humanist approach. A couple of quick quotes here. One thing they say, schooling and formal education are essential. So if you are a homeschooler, the UN doesn't like you very much. Another, the highlighted bit you have there, they're talking about the basic principles of the policy. This means moving beyond literacy and numeracy to focus on learning environments and on new approaches to learning for greater justice, social equity, and global solidarity. Not quite sure exactly what that means, actually. Education must be about learning to live on a planet under pressure. So you must buy into the green agenda or you're not educated. It must be about cultural literacy. Again, what exactly is cultural literacy? Presumably it means that you have to accept certain things and certain beliefs on the basis of respect and equal dignity. So everything's equal. That's cultural relativism. That's moral relativism. There is no right and wrong. Everything's equal. Helping to weave together the social, economic, and environmental dimensions of a sustainable development. This is a humanist vision of education as an essential common good. So we're not empowering the individual to be able to discern truth to be able to advance his or her knowledge, to be able to ask questions, to be able to learn well by questioning well. No, that's not the agenda. You have to buy the entire global political Marxist come environmentalist come communitarian package. That is what education has been defined as here by the UN.
David, this is we're getting here to the heart of the problem over education. Who's driving the policy? It isn't just coming through the government or the EU. This is UN policy coming in. You mentioned the cultural bit. What came into my mind was cultural intelligence, which of course is what Common Purpose is now pushing through. Julia Middleton waxing lyrical on cultural intelligence. This is where the policy's coming from. And I've just got a couple of extra pieces of text from that document. And just for people here, it says that they've had an East-West roundtable discussion convened in New Delhi. And more recently, from those who see themselves as transhumanists or even post-humanists, with their calls for biological selection and radical enhancement. This is getting into really dangerous ground. This is the experimentation. This is killing off the weak and the vulnerable, useless to society, and enhancing human beings. The tree on the front of this document, I believe, is highly significant. This is a cult. This is the tree of knowledge. But we've now got UNESCO here admitting that there's no proper spirituality in them. They're humanists at best, but I think there's something satanic in this organisation and the way it's going for the children.
Yes, the biological selection that used to be called eugenics, and the whole eugenics movement got a bit of a bad reputation with Nazi Germany, but it was originally started in England. The main driver was in fact America. There's a very interesting book I recommend to anyone listening called War Against the Weak, which documents the history of completely fake science, which dominated matters in America and was a means of encouraging more children from the fit and fewer from the unfit in order to breed an improved master race. And of course, who defines who is fit and who is unfit? Well, that would be the powers that be, that would be the government, that would be the people in power. So if you're the wrong colour, the wrong nationality, or have the wrong social background, woe betide you. And it was an utterly appalling. There was a sequence of forced sterilizations and assorted assaults on the individual. It was a dreadful time in America. America led, Nazi Germany followed, and it's coming back.
And of course, Planned Parenthood has been part of that drive, but this is absolutely key. Where did these horrific policies originate? They didn't originate in Germany, Nazi Germany. They originated in London, moved across to the States, and we even had people like Mr. Churchill, who was a proponent of this. So does require Britain as a nation to have a good look at itself, but very dark, dangerous policy. You were keen to mention this gentleman who was actually stood up against some of this stuff, John Taylor Gatto. What can you tell us about him?
John Taylor Gatto is the antidote to the New World Order version of education. He was New York State Teacher of the Year, New York City Teacher of the Year, and then resigned in the op-ed page of the New York Times. And the reason he resigned and the reason he was having such huge success in an inner city sink school with great poverty, a disproportionately large black population, very disadvantaged, and these kids were going to top universities. They were thriving under his direction and tutelage. And the reason he had to resign is he was succeeding by completely subverting the system. And he was doing it by going under the radar. And when they gave him awards and made him famous and people started watching him, he couldn't do it anymore because he was meant to have 30 children under his control, and people would come into the class and there'd be 3 kids there. And where are they all? And he was running out of excuses. What they were doing is real things, and they were learning by engaging in something called life. And his books are fantastic on the subject of education, and I can't recommend them highly enough. A quick couple of quotes just to share with you. He's got, in our secular society, school has become the replacement for church. And like church, it requires that its teachings must be taken on faith. That is very true. And a longer quote here, he says, I've noticed a fascinating phenomenon in my 30 years of teaching. Schools and schooling are increasingly irrelevant to the great enterprises of the planet. No one believes anymore that scientists are trained in science classes, or politicians in civics classes, or poets in English classes. The truth is that schools don't really teach anything except how to obey orders. This is the great mystery to me, because thousands of humane, caring people work in schools as teachers and aides and administrators, but the abstract logic of the institution overwhelms their individual contributions. Although teachers care, teachers do care and do work very, very hard, the institution is psychopathic. It has no conscience. It rings bells, and the young man in the middle of writing a poem must close his notebook and move to a different cell where he must memorize that humans and monkeys derive from a common ancestor. He is exceptionally insightful on the subject of education. I went through the entire education system in this country. I personally feel it took me 25 years to recover from our education system, because it teaches you things that you don't realize are being taught. It teaches obedience. It teaches that you are dependent on others providing you with information you cannot really think for yourself. It teaches you that you simply follow what others have written, and original thought is beyond you. It teaches a lot of things which are wrong and extremely harmful.
And perhaps we just give people a reminder, if you're not aware of the subject, have a look at Common Core, breaking out in America. A lot of American parents extremely unhappy at what they see as a major dumbing down of American education. And the name of Dumbing Down of America, also the name of a book. You should be able to find that online. I'm afraid the author's name escapes me at the moment. It'll come back in a minute. But a very good analysis of how the American education system in particular has been attacked. And we'll just add to that, some parents from Cornwall gave us a copy of a questionnaire which has apparently been given out in most of the Cornish schools. About 24 pages asking the most unbelievable questions, apart from highly personal questions. Most of it is to do with drugs and all forms of sex and sexual diseases. It's to do with bullying, threats, violence. Almost none of those questions pertain to are you learning something in school? We're going to be doing a detailed feature on this in due course, but symptomatic of what you're talking about, I think, David. Well, who is going to expose all this? Can we trust our mainstream press and journalists to do that, Mike?
Increasingly not, and it seems that journalists just getting sacked, more and more of them. So this is the Lancashire Telegraph in this case, and their editor, Kevin Young, was sacked in July after 15 years at the paper. He hasn't been replaced. His deputy, Alan Simpson, has just been sacked, along with their picture editor, Neil Johnson. And so there's no management or editorial team left at that particular newspaper, and the National Union of Journalists really saying that this is happening in many different places. So what's going on, Brian? We know that there was a change of staff, shall we say, and a change of tack at the Telegraph recently. Is there a purge of journalists that are looking in particular directions, perhaps?
I think that's exactly what's happening, Mike. And of course, what we need to remember is that there has been this huge takeover of independent local newspapers in particular. So when you get your local paper, which still calls itself local, often will still say it's independent, in fact is really owned by one of the vast news groups, then what we're seeing is that the policy within those local papers is being controlled centrally, so you don't get any editorial viewpoint which really counts in the area. And now what I think is we're into the final phase, which is purge out any of the old style journalists who really know how to do their job, get out there and investigate. You don't want them in an organisation because these newspapers are only there to give government propaganda. And probably that Mail article we've just mentioned, what was it really? All it was putting forward the government's Ofcom viewpoint. So I think this is a very dangerous phase, and it's time that Britain's journalists woke up to the fact that there's a dictatorship coming in by the day. There have been some reports north of the border, though, which have been of value in relation to Robert Greene, David.
Yes, we've had a good week or two on the Robert Greene front. This is an article from last Sunday's Scottish Sunday Express by Scottish editor Ben Borland. I'll just read the first paragraph here. Scotland's public spending watchdog is investigating claims that the Crown Office has a secret slush fund of public money to pay for private legal fees. Audit Scotland began looking into the allegations after being presented with a dossier by campaigners David Scott and Robert Greene on Friday, October 2. The probe was launched within days by Assistant Director Angela Cullen, with support from the watchdog's Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service audit team. On November 5, a member of Audit Scotland's team wrote to Mr Scott to say that a number of interviews and other work had taken place. The investigation centres on payments to top Glasgow law firm Levy and McRae in relation to a civil case brought by former Lord Advocate Dame Elise Angelini in 2012. We'll stop there. That's been greeted with great interest by several of the opposition political parties in Scotland. It's getting noticed. It's strange that the Holly Gregg story people find difficult to believe, and they find it too shocking and can't quite face it. But when it comes to money, people understand money, and it's more readily accountable for, it's more easy to measure, and it seems to be getting quite a bit of traction.
Well, that's really good to hear, but we should also remind viewers and listeners that, of course, Eilish Angelini was the lady recommended by Home Secretary Theresa May as ideal to run a number of investigations. Apparently, Theresa May was unaware of these investigations going on at the time she made her appointments. Presumably, the security services weren't interested in that either. Well, war, Mike.
Yes, right. So if we go back to last year, I think this was mid-2014 or so, Pope Francis began using the term piecemeal World War III. He was saying, here's a quote, "Even today, after the second failure of another world war, perhaps one can speak of a third war, one fought piecemeal with crimes, massacres, destruction." And so I thought we should just take today's news headlines as one example, just one day, and look at what's going on around the world, at least according to the mainstream media, and see whether this is a fair assessment of what's going on. So in London, we had a bomb scare which closed Baker Street. In Honduras, we had Syrian passports apparently magically heading towards the United States. In Italy, we had forces searching for 5 terror suspects after an attack warning. We've got concern for what's going on in Rio, so Rio clearly is a potential target as well. Perhaps unsurprisingly, Northern Ireland as well. And in Mali, of course, today we have what seems to be another real attack with casualties. but we wait to see what the final outcome of that is. So right around the world, just about in every continent, we've got this stuff going on. But in the mainstream media as well, we've got to remember these are partying women, and in fact, they are also petty criminals, suddenly turned into jihadists, into commando style, capable of running commando style operations on multiple sites, organize the weapons, pull all this stuff together, despite being just party animals and petty thieves. So really, if this is a third world war that's going on at the minute, a piecemeal third world war, one of the biggest pieces is the attack on the mind, Brian. And this type of world war can only take place if we allow ourselves to be terrorized in this way.
Well, this is absolutely it, isn't it? Is keeping nations and many nation states in a sense of fear and confusion. You don't know who to trust. You don't know who your neighbour is. And then we're at constant war, as predicted in that wonderful book, 1984. So peace has become war, peace. Nobody knows what's going on. I'm going to come back to this. I will just say the reports that we're getting in, that in UK at the moment, senior British military officers are apparently at the stage where they are saying what is going on. And this is particularly interesting because this is the stage pre-waking up. But at the moment, I'm being told that senior British military officers are looking with amazement at what's unfolding in this country. They're not being consulted on defence and security matters. That is being carried out simply within the Cabinet Office. Oliver Letwin is the man who is apparently running the show at the moment. Don't take any notice of David Cameron. He's just the upfront puppet in front of the cameras. The Cabinet Office is apparently where policy is taking place. And if we get time, I've got a slide for the end of the show saying have a good look at who these Tories really are, because massive bullying and intimidation going on at the heart of the Tories. So confusion within Britain, this is not accidental, this is deliberate. If you confuse people, then of course you can drift in whatever policy that you want. Well, how's all this stuff funded? I think it's back to you, David, and the role of drugs.
Yes, this is a book. It's quite a hefty book. It is wonderful, though. If you want to understand how the world actually works, this is an essential read. Right? So it's the politics of heroin, and it covers all of principally the American involvement with the drugs trade via the CIA. It starts in Southeast Asia when, after the Second World War, the French were fighting an anti-insurgency war to hold on to what was then French Indochina. They lost in Bien Bien Phu. They had to withdraw. The Americans replaced them. The French had been funding guerrilla groups that were friendly to them via heroin as money, essentially. And the Americans moved in and did likewise. And it went from there through the Vietnam War. And then once they moved out of Vietnam, escalating all the time. The entire war in Laos, the entire American war in Laos was funded by the drugs trade, controlled and operated by the CIA. Once the Vietnam War closed down in 1975, it moved to Kurdistan, it moved to Iran, it moved to Pakistan, it moved to Afghanistan, and it moved to South America. This book names names. It gives you places, it gives you dates, it gives you all the information. And it's been in publication since about the late 80s, mid-80s. No one's ever sued the author. No one's ever sued. It names all these names. No one's ever sued. Why is no one sued? Because it's true, because truth is an absolute defense against libel. So what you're seeing there, and it makes it quite clear, quite absolutely clear, that what the CIA have been doing is running black operations, funding insurgency wars, irregular terrorist activities, to destabilize regimes, and to fight proxy wars, and providing arms and money to do this, all off budget. So it's not done through the American taxpayer, it's not done through the American budget. And how are they funding this? They're funding it by running the drugs trade and selling drugs all around the world, and principally to young people in America.
And David,
sorry,
go ahead.
I was just going to say there, David, it's really interesting because, and this is quite opportune because what is really not being discussed in the mainstream media at all at the moment is the heroin crisis, and it is a crisis that's going on in the United States at the moment, and it's not a crisis within the black community, it's a crisis of the middle classes, and we're seeing middle class suicides going through the roof as a result of what is becoming a heroin epidemic. And of course, at the end of the day, the CIA and other organizations of that ilk could not do what they're doing without the person at the end of the chain buying the product.
This is right. And if you look at the harm, and you can see the graphs of harm, suicides, drug-related deaths, etc. in America, it's going steadily upwards. And then suddenly, around about 2010, 2011, it takes off like a rocket. And the level of harm has more than doubled in the short period since then. So there's a lot more heroin dealing going in to the United States. 2010, 2011, does that ring any bells? Does that correlate to when ISIS started to become a real threat and was reorganized in Iraq? Well, yes, it does.
David, I'll bring those statistics in for you. You mentioned to me in relation to the truth about the heroin trade that this gentleman had been doing some really amazing things. Former narcotics investigator Mike Rupert. So
that's not Mike. I think that's someone introducing Mike. Yes, that's Mike Rupert. Yep. Now this is all on YouTube, and I thoroughly recommend. Again, there's a lecture by Mike Rupert on YouTube, and there's also this screenshot here is from when he confronted the deputy director of the CIA with this information in a public meeting, fully televised in front of Congress people, a congressman and a congresswoman, and a large crowd of very interested and involved people in Los Angeles who were tired of what the drugs were doing to their communities. And he confronted deputy director of the CIA and ended his career there and then. So he did well.
Another brave person speaking out. And then the statistics. Well, of course, the Russia Today has been picking up on this. 120 deaths a day, US heroin and prescription drugs epidemic spinning out of control. And this is one of the graphs from usnews.com.
See, around about 2010, 2011, off it shoots. And that correlates with when ISIS started. Now, that's a correlation. It's not absolute proof, but this is how it's done. You read the book. This is how the CIA funds dirty wars.
Right. And you'd also pointed out this. So we've chopped from that graph where the steep increases from 2010. And this is the New York Times talking about the rise of insurgent groups and naming of new leaders.
Yes, and that comes from 2010, and that's when things started to kick off in Iraq, and then the drugs problem in America gets even worse around 2013, 14, and that's when you start seeing the Syria crisis kicking off.
Yeah, dangerous, very dangerous things. Now, one of the facts at the moment is, of course, the terrorism story. Paris has completely wiped out anything to do with child abuse in the UK. So the Goddard inquiry must be sighing relief that public attention's been totally nudged away by Paris. But interesting things have been happening on the abuse side north of the border.
Yes, we're seeing very hopeful signs here where people who have been through this abuse are banding together. They're getting to know one another. They're forming groups. And they're starting to fight for justice. So they now have a well-organised White Flowers group here, and they were campaigning hard to have a Scottish national inquiry. and the inquiry was announced. A year later, we find out what the terms of reference are, and the terms of reference are so tight that almost everybody's excluded. It's only if you were in residential care that you're covered by the Scottish Inquiry. If you were abused at a day school, if you're abused by a senior politician, if you're abused in any other context, by any form of institutional abuse that is not an institution where you slept at night, isn't covered by the Scottish Inquiry. So most of these people who are campaigning find that they're left out in the cold, and they're not happy. They're looking at legal action, and I very much hope they go that route. And I would also very much hope that the press and the public can get behind them and demand that our wise overlords do what they said they would do in the first place, which is have a full, open, public, frank, clear inquiry into what actually happened.
David, and you obviously feel very strongly about that. I'm not surprised, but you'd had a little bit of a contretemps with a Mr. Leask, who hasn't been reporting on the important things.
Mr. Leask is the gentleman who did the hit piece in the Herald on Holly Greig, right? And it was the single slimiest piece of journalism I have ever seen in my life. It is a masterclass on slime. It created an impression that there was nothing in the Holly Greig story, and it wove facts and half-truths and suggestions in such a way that could only be done intentionally. There's no way this is an accident. This was an intentional hit piece. We are told, right? I have heard the word on the street is that there was a quid pro quo on offer, but that wasn't followed through on because no other journalist would touch the story, and it died with Mr. Leask. Mr. Leask is very senior, and he's still on staff at the Herald, and he was tweeting very boldly about freedom of speech. So I tweeted back at him and said, this doesn't apply if you're speaking up for Holly Greig. David. And I was immediately blocked. So I thought it was quite amusing that the tweet on freedom of speech, as soon as you then mention Holly Greig, that freedom of speech doesn't apply, and you're immediately silenced by the Herald senior journalist, David Leask. I thought that was quite funny.
Well, the thing is, as a future leader, I'm sure that David Leask has been selected as a future leader. He was using cultural intelligence to stop anything that was remotely close to the truth. Well, another lady who has put herself in the spotlight is Barbara Hewson, the QC that has made some pretty outrageous public statements. Satanic ritual abuse doesn't exist. She made some comments about age of consent. 13, I think, was where she was heading. And you've taken her to task on a few things. Cassandra, as she's better known.
Yes. We covered this last week. It was covered in the column. It was a very good piece. And I tweeted out a link and said David more on Hewson. And she obviously spotted this. Now, bear in mind, this is a QC. This is someone who should be using precise and legal language. She replied, moron watch. Extraordinary how some still fanatically dig up ye olde columns about me. More fascinating than ISIS. So there you go. So I thought that was an interesting response from her. So I forwarded that on to people following me on Twitter. I'm saying she's feeling touchy about public interest in her anti-child, anti-life views. She's also running a major abortion charity. And she came back, not at all. What interests me are the sociopaths. Again, I don't know exactly who she's referring to there. Perhaps me, I don't know. If so, it seems very un-QC language and, perhaps even defamatory under Scots law, but hey-ho.
Shall I just bring this on screen? Because there's been a little bit of digging into Cassandra and what that was all about. So,
and then she blocked me, right? So it's been a good week for me getting blocked on Twitter. But I did thought, well, why does she call herself Cassandra? So, Google's a wonderful thing. So we did a little bit of digging. And as you see here, We found that Cassandra, one of the Greek myths regarding Cassandra, is that she talks to snakes and gets information from snakes, which I thought was quite an interesting name to pick for your Twitter personality.
Yeah, well, of course, we don't know that she knew that at the time, but it is interesting.
Well, no.
We got some very well-informed comment on the Cassandra avatar. It's difficult to see on the Twitter page, but this is the actual image. And this was the comment that came in. I'll just take people through it. A tombstone broken at the crux of the cross, apparently is crucifixion despised. Peacock symbolises Satan's right-hand demon and master of his wardrobe, Andramelech, the demon of arrogant display. And that links into the Order of the Peacock Angel, the Bloomsbury set. Now remember, this is just somebody's comment on this avatar. This is educated comment, but it's very interesting. Nibbling the vine, scoffing at the blood of Christ. And then we've got some geometric patterns on the cross, which the person says is a replica of perhaps Anglo-Saxon Celtic patterning of the late first millennium AD. So it's interesting, isn't it? Of course, we can't say that that's why she chose it, but
we can't. No, we don't know why she chose it. We did go to someone who is located in the Middle East and Asia area, who is expert in these things, and he said, responding to your inquiry about the symbolism of the tombstone, I will have to say that it is Satan that is depicted on the tombstone in the form of Amaleki Taus, a Yazidi form of devil, normally depicted as a peacock. He asked, where did the woman in London get it from? We obviously don't know that either.
No, just fascinating. And it gives us an insight, of course, into information coming across the internet, which presumably Ofcom wants squashed as soon as possible. Where does that leave us? Let's just go here. Nothing to hide, nothing to fear, Mike.
You would think so. That's what we're told. But this is Tom Watson's article in the Independent, which I wanted to highlight. I'll just read a little bit of it. He says he shares concerns of campaigners who fear the Independent Commission examining this is the Freedom of Information Act, will recommend the introduction of fees for freedom of information requests and rule that entire tranches of information should be exempt and stay secret. So what he says is 5 years ago, David Cameron promised to lead the most transparent administration in history, declaring that sunshine is the best disinfectant. But now the Prime Minister is drawing the blinds on open government. He went on to say the Cabinet has appointed an independent commission to examine the Freedom of Information Act, which was passed by a Labour government in 2000 and came into effect in 2005. A public consultation ends today, and given that the Commission's 5 members, who include ex-Ofcom chair Dame Patricia Hodgson and former Tory leader Michael Hard, have publicly criticised the FOI regime, its conclusions are a foregone conclusion. There is a strong argument in favour of extending and strengthening the Act, this is what he concluded with, so that it covers organisations that are given public money, such as free schools and companies that win large government contracts. Now, my understanding from people that are quite familiar with the legislation, is that the Information Commissioner's attitude is that when government outsources things to private companies, that those private companies would be subject to the Act already, even at least with regard to the service that they're providing on behalf of government. Tom Watson doesn't seem to agree with that, but I think so. There's maybe some clarification needed there. But then Tom Watson goes on to say, accountability must not stop where the private sector involvement begins. And of course, we would agree with that. And he ends with, as the Prime Minister once argued, bad decisions are made in the darkest corners of government when the light of public scrutiny can't penetrate them. He should let the sun shine in. Well, clearly he doesn't want to do that. He's clearly fearful of what people are finding via the Freedom of Information Act. He wants to shut it down as quickly as possible. So I'm just going to continue to throw the statement that they love to make, nothing to hide, nothing to fear, right back in their faces.
There I pause, just remembering David Cameron, of course, removing all of the information from the Conservative website. What do you think, David? A few comments to end on. Should we trust Mr. Cameron?
No, I don't think we should trust any of our wise overlords. On the Freedom of Information request front, we tried very hard to find out how much public money had been spent defending private civil actions by members and former members of the Crown Office in Scotland. And we couldn't get it because the Crown Office refused to release information. And the Information Commissioner initially said we had no right to it. We managed to demonstrate that that was in fact wrong. And he had ultimately to admit that, yes, we did have a right to it, but he found that there was an overwhelming public interest to keep it secret. So not knowing how many millions of pounds of public money had been spent defending members of the Crown Office in Scotland in private civil legal actions, that would adversely affect the smooth running of government, and we're not allowed to know that because it's not in our interest. So I would suggest that the Freedom of Information Act, rather than needing rolled back, needs rolled out further. We should have far more transparency, not less.
Absolutely. Well, here's probably one ending reason why the Conservatives are getting very, very edgy at the moment is, of course, there's a big spat going on inside the party. Not going to go into detail here, but if you haven't seen this, have a look at the Guido Fawkes site where he's reporting on bullying lies and a massive cover-up. People beginning to scatter in all directions as the information comes to the surface. And this is the power of exposure. You don't need huge weapons in order to deal with these people. It's simply get the truth and get it exposed, because this is what they're absolutely terrified of. Of course, if we could get hold of the picture of Mr. Cameron and the theoretical pig, everything would be over, but we're still waiting for that. And that brings us to the end of today's news. Thank you very much for joining us. David, thank you for joining us from north of the border. If you like what we are all doing, please consider making a donation. We can only keep going with your help and support, or consider a subscription with us, which is even better. It's your effort that keeps us going. If you'd like to see us do more, if you'd like to see greater depth of the programmes and use of better studio facilities where I can't reach out and touch both walls simultaneously, we need your help and support. Have a good weekend. Don't get depressed. Get into those Tesco queues and tell people what's really happening. Thanks for joining us. Bye-bye.